Tell us a little bit about September the 11th, 2001. Where were you when you heard that the planes hit the World Trade Center in Washington, D.C., and another plane hit the Pentagon here in Washington?
You know, I remember I was
New
in
York, I should say.
Yeah,
rather
I
than Washington.
was in the West Wing when hit the second tower. I remember that up in the upstairs counsel's office with a couple other people in the counsel's office, and then we were ushered downstairs and then told to get out and run out because there was fear, as we later learned, about Flight 93. I think don't know whether it was headed to the Capitol or the White House or some other target, of course. And the heroes of Flight 93 saved so many Americans. Sacrifice that, of course, we still all celebrate in the sense of celebrating their lives and their heroism for saving all of us here in Washington. But ended up out in Lafayette Park with the rest of the staff and bewildered, and changed America, changed the world, changed the presidency, changed Congress, changed the courts, all the issues that came before. It was a new kind of war, as President Bush described, with an enemy that didn't wear uniforms and that would attack civilians. And so new kinds of laws had to be considered, and Congress had to work through that. And President Bush had to focus so intently. And as I've said before, my remembrance is that on September 12th, his basic mentality was this will not happen again. And having traveling with him from 2003 to 2006 everywhere as staff secretary and seeing him up close, I still think every day I was with him during those years, every morning when he got up, it was still September 12th, 2001. This will not happen again. And to see that focus, of course, he had to do all the other things of the presidency and all the other legislative and regulatory and ceremonial aspects, but he was so focused on that. And I'm sure that's been true of the succeeding presidents as well, because the threat still exists, of course.
Well, as we came to learn, Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda was responsible for that attack and has now morphed into other organizations like ISIS and the like. But I want to ask you, you had to then sit in judgment later on in a case, the Hamdan case, which you've alluded to earlier, where the defendant was Osama bin Laden's personal bodyguard and driver. He was captured by U.S. forces in Afghanistan after 9/11 and detained in Guantanamo Bay. He subsequently went through a military tribunal, and then that case was appealed to your court. And just correct me if I'm wrong, but notwithstanding the experience you and everybody you cared about having been through this terrible travesty of 9/11, you ruled in favor of Osama bin Laden's bodyguard and driver, correct?
That is correct. I wrote the majority opinion.
How could you do that? How could you possibly do that?
The rule of law applies to all who come before the courts of the United States.
Even an enemy combatant?
Equal justice under law. Everyone is entitled to...
Even a non-citizen?
Yes. Non-citizens who are tried in U.S. courts, of course, have the constitutional rights. And really my model on that judicial model for thinking about something like that, because I thought about what you're asking about. Justice Jackson, of course, Robert Jackson, who had been Franklin Roosevelt's Attorney General, that he's in the Korematsu case, even though that was one of President Roosevelt's policies. Justice Jackson, now the majority opinion now overruled, but Justice Jackson dissented and ruled against the Roosevelt policy. Justices Clark and Burton, two appointees of President Truman, are the two deciding votes in Youngstown Steel. That's a 6-3 decision. Those two are the deciding votes, therefore. They both were appointees of President Truman. They get to and it's wartime against Korea. They get to the Supreme Court, they're the deciding votes in the Youngstown Steel case, which was an extraordinary national moment, one of the great moments. And so it's your conception of the role of a judge it's about the law. That's distinct from policy, and our judiciary depends on having people in it, and we are fortunate to have a wonderful federal judiciary, people in it who understand the difference between law and policy and are willing to apply principles of equal justice under law to anyone who comes before the court. Even the most unpopular possible defendant is still entitled to due process and the rule of law, and I've tried to ensure that as a judge.
Well, it's hard for me to imagine a more unpopular defendant than Osama bin Laden's driver and personal bodyguard. So I find the suggestion that somehow you are prejudiced against the small guy in favor of the big guy, or that you are picking and choosing who you're going to render judgment in favor of based on something other than the rule of law. I think this answers that question conclusively for me. The fact that you could separate yourself from the emotional involvement you had, along with so many people you worked closely with in the White House on September the 11th, and you could then, as a judge, after you put on the black robe and take the oath of office, you could then render a judgment in favor of Osama bin Laden's bodyguard and driver because you apply the law equally to everybody that comes to your court.